All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive into the Quran?
Definitely. Always fascinating to see what we can uncover.
You know, it's amazing how these chapters just keep building on each other. We saw that dramatic shift in chapters 8, 9, and 10, almost like it was suddenly speaking to a Jewish audience.
Yeah, and now we're going to see how that continues to play out in chapters 11 and 12.
And let me tell you, these chapters do not disappoint. We've got some really interesting stuff here, possible scribal errors, alternative endings, even more clues about how the Quran evolved over time.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it?
It really is. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with chapter 11, officially numbered 93. It opens with, well, I guess you could say a familiar scene.
Familiar? How so?
Well, it starts with those poetic oaths, the swearing by morning brightness in the night.
Right, right. We've seen that before.
Exactly. Okay, so here's the beginning of chapter 11. By the morning brightness, and by the night when it covers with darkness. Your Lord has not taken leave of you, nor has he detested you. And the hereafter is better for you than the first. And your Lord is going to give you, and you will be satisfied. Did he not find you an orphan and give refuge? And he found you lost and guided, and he found you poor and made self-sufficient.
What I find interesting here is there's kind of a shift in tone
Okay.
from the really direct,
Huh?
almost declarative style of some of the earlier chapters
Right.
to something that feels a bit more personal in this one.
Yeah. It's almost like a friend trying to comfort someone
Yeah.
who's going through a rough patch.
Exactly.
It almost seems like it could be directed toward newer followers,
Right.
people who might not be as familiar
Yeah.
with the older, more established traditions.
Yeah, the folks who've been around for a while, they've heard it all before.
Right, right. What makes you think that, though?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that Allah's name isn't actually mentioned in this chapter.
Mm,
And this absence, combined with the change in style,
yeah.
kind of suggests to me that it might be geared towards people who join the community a little later.
Okay.
Maybe after a period where the message was more focused
Mhm.
on engaging with a Jewish audience.
Interesting. So we've got this group of newer followers
Yeah,
who might be feeling a bit unsure or lost or something.
exactly.
And then we come to these really key verses
Yeah.
where the speaker reassuring listeners
Mm-hmm.
that they haven't been abandoned
Yeah.
and that a greater reward awaits them in the afterlife.
There's something better coming.
Right. Does this suggest that these newer followers might have been struggling to maintain their faith
Mm-hmm.
in the face of hardship?
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. And when you look at the verses about providing for orphans and the poor,
Right.
giving them refuge, guidance, and support,
All of that.
it paints a picture of a community
Yeah.
facing some very real
Mm-hmm.
social and economic challenges.
Real world problem.
Right. It's not a stretch to imagine that Muhammad
Uh-huh.
was emerging as a leader
Yeah.
for a group that was facing poverty
Yeah.
and marginalization.
Trying to find their place.
Right. So this chapter could be a direct response to their anxieties and concerns.
It makes sense.
Now let's move on to chapter 12,
Okay.
officially 94. And here's where things get particularly interesting.
Right.
And I'm curious to get your take on this.
Go ahead.
There's a sudden shift from focusing on the divine,
Yeah.
using he, to using we, almost as if speaking for a collective.
Interesting. What do you make of that?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you.
Well, it's a really intriguing change,
It is.
especially because earlier chapters almost exclusively used I
Right.
for those divine pronouncements.
Right. God speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
So this shift to we
Yeah,
has led to a lot of debate
of course.
and a couple of interesting possibilities.
Right.
One theory is that it was a deliberate choice,
Could be.
a way to represent the voice of the entire community
Mm-hmm. Like a collective voice.
and underline their efforts to overcome hardship.
Working together.
So it's more of a we're all in this together kind of vibe.
Exactly. We're united in facing these challenges.
Okay.
But there's another theory
Okay.
that raises some interesting questions
Okay.
about how this text was transmitted over time.
Uh-huh.
It's possible that the original he
Okay.
was mistakenly changed to we by a scribe.
A scribe.
Yeah, maybe because these words sound quite similar in Arabic.
Oh, so we've got potential scribal errors to consider now.
It's always a possibility with ancient texts.
Okay. And how about the repeated phrase?
Yeah,
For indeed with hardship comes ease.
right.
Do you think that repetition is another potential scribal error?
It's possible it was a scribal error,
Right.
which, highlights the challenges of interpreting these ancient texts.
Yeah, we've got a lot to consider here.
We do.
So far, we've got a community
Yeah.
facing poverty and doubt,
Mm-hmm.
a comforting voice offering reassurance,
Trying to lift them up.
a possible shift in the audience,
Yeah.
and now the introduction of potential scribal errors,
Mm.
and this intriguing change in voice.
It all adds up.
Is there any connection between these two chapters beyond just their placement one after the other?
There's a really fascinating possibility that some scholars have suggested.
Oh, what's that?
Could chapter 12 actually be an alternative ending to chapter 11?
Wait, alternative endings.
Yeah.
Like a choose-your-own-adventure Quran.
Not quite that dramatic,
Okay.
but it points to the idea that oral traditions
Right.
can be pretty fluid
Uh-huh.
and that texts might have been compiled in different ways.
Right.
Remember, these chapters were likely circulating orally
Yeah.
before being written down.
Okay, so someone was going around saying all this.
Exactly. And as they were passed along,
Yeah.
maybe some variations crept in.
That's amazing. Now let's move on to chapter 12, officially numbered 94. First thing you notice,
It's short.
it is. And no customary swearing to start things off.
Interesting. It almost feels like it's picking up right where chapter 11 left off.
Right, like an alternative ending,
Yeah.
continuing that same theme of reassurance.
And both chapters start with similar questions, highlighting all the good things that have been done for the followers.
Right.
But there's a difference in the language, a small but potentially very significant difference.
You're talking about the he versus we, right?
Exactly.
In chapter 11, it's, did he not find you an orphan and give refuge? And he found you lost and guided.
Yeah.
And he found you poor and made self-sufficient.
Right.
Then in chapter 12, it shifts to, did we not expand for you your breast? And we removed from you your burden, which had weighed upon your back, and raised high for you your repute. So what's the explanation?
Well, could be a simple scribal error. We and he sound very similar in Arabic, it happens.
A slip of the pen with huge implications. So this tiny little word change could point to a huge shift in how early Muslims saw themselves and their faith.
That's what's so fascinating about this, isn't it? These seemingly small details, they can open up whole new ways of looking at the Quran.
Absolutely. Okay, so we just finished exploring chapters 11 and 12. And man, there's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? Comforting messages, possible scribal errors, hints of, I don't know, maybe some internal struggles within the early Muslim community. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. And, if you think about the historical context, it makes even more sense.
Oh, absolutely.
We were talking about Muhammad potentially trying to appeal to a Jewish audience in those earlier chapters, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it seems like that might not have gone as smoothly as he'd hoped.
What makes you say that?
Well, the sources suggest this was a tough time for Muhammad and his followers. We're talking economic hardship, potential discontent, maybe even pushback from some of the wealthier Jewish folks who weren't exactly buying into this whole message of charity and community support.
Right. So it's not just about theological differences. There's this whole social and economic layer to it.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how that might have shaped the development of the Quran itself.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, maybe Muhammad is trying to address those very real concerns.
Right.
Offering hope and reassurance to those who are struggling.
That's a very good point. And that's where those comforting verses we talked about become even more significant. Your Lord has not taken leave of you, nor has he detested you, and the hereafter is better for you than the first, and your Lord is going to give you, and you will be satisfied. These are powerful statements, especially in the midst of hardship.
Yeah, no kidding. Speaking of getting into the weeds, I wanted to circle back to those typos and inconsistencies we were talking about. They might seem like minor details, but they could be super important, couldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes those tiny little details are the key to unlocking a whole new understanding. Think of it like, I don't know, finding a fingerprint at a crime scene. A seemingly insignificant piece of evidence can change the entire investigation.
Exactly. So let's put on our detective hats here for a second. Alternative endings and the possibility of scribal errors. Makes you wonder how much of what we read in the Quran
Yeah.
might have been shaped by
Right.
the process of transmission and interpretation.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at the words on the page.
Right.
We're looking at the historical, the cultural,
Yeah.
the linguistic forces
Yeah.
that shaped our understanding of them.
What can these typos and inconsistencies tell us about the people who actually wrote and compiled these texts?
Well, for one thing, they remind us that the Quran wasn't just, poof, dictated by God and then perfectly transcribed into a book. It was a human process involving real people with their own limitations, biases, interpretations.
So even though Muslims believe the Quran is the word of God, it was still filtered through human hands.
That's right. And that doesn't have to diminish its significance. It just means we need to approach it with a little bit of humility.
Right, like our understanding of it can evolve.
Exactly. There might be multiple layers of meaning, different interpretations, and that's okay.
That's a really good point. It's not about dismissing the faith of millions of people. It's about recognizing that this is a complex text with a rich history. Before we move on, I just want to touch on that repeated line in chapter 12 again. For indeed with hardship ease. Indeed with hardship ease. What do you make of that?
Well, as we talked about before, it's most likely a simple scribal error, a duplication that slipped through. But even though it's probably a mistake, it still raises some interesting questions.
Like what?
And what does it tell us about how the Quran was put together?
It's like a tiny little crack in the surface that hints at this whole complex, messy process of assembling these sacred texts.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if there are other hidden clues just waiting to be discovered. Other subtle inconsistencies, repetitions, things that might shed light on how the Quran evolved over time.
Yeah, that's what makes this so much fun. It's like being a detective, always on the lookout for those little details that can unlock a bigger story.
I couldn't agree more.
Never know what you might discover. Until next time.